In this presentation, I will be talking about social engineering and welfare in Europe between the 1500 and the 2000. The content of the presentation is based on Chapter 4.2 of the handbook The European Experience, a multi-perspective history of modern Europe 1500s-2000, and we will structure the presentation as the chapter is structured. We will start by looking at examples of social engineering in early modern history and ask ourselves whether we can identify such examples. Then, we will look at urbanization, family, and labor in modern history, and at the approach of states to these three components of social life. Finally, we will look at these three domains in contemporary history, reflecting on what changed throughout the 20th century and what does this tell us about welfare and welfare models in Europe then and today. So let's start. The period between the 1500s and the 1800s was characterized by a growth in population across Europe. This, combined with an evolution of agriculture and industry, led to a slow and steady process of urbanization and emptying of the rural areas. In cities across Europe, the density of population grew at a regular rate. This happened at a faster pace than developments of the industry and advancements of job safety, thus resulting in an increasing number of people working for low wages and with insecure employment. This, in turn, resulted in an increased amount of people living in conditions of poverty, often resorting to begging and vagrancy. The early modern period, relief for the poor was administered in three ways: through ecclesiastical charity, with private and corporate initiatives, with the first prototypes of state-led poor relief acts. We will focus on the first two. Following a trend well established in the Middle Ages, Christian communities across Europe heeded the commandment to love thy neighbor and carried out charitable work in their local and social contexts by feeding and dressing the poor and by providing shelter. At the same time, Jewish community carried out similar activities under one of the Jewish precepts. As a result of this, ecclesiastical charity was often fragmented and closely linked with the fate of not only the people administering the relief, but also the people receiving it. This fragmentation could, in some cases, undermine the nationalization and regulation of welfare, aiming at providing basic relief across community boundaries. Starting with the Reformation, a new type of poor relief started to take traction: corporate and private charity, often organized around the linchpin of schooling. Reformed clergy and societies, in fact, insisted that Bible reading was an integral part of the good Christian's life, thus promoting and calling for universal schooling. While some authorities started issuing compulsory education laws, it was rich private individuals founded orphanages, where children would receive not only a religious education, but would also learn a trade, thus granting their possibility to find a job and hopefully to leave poverty in their adulthood to carry out most of these corporate charities. An example of this is the Halle orphanage, funded by August Hermann Franke in the 18th century. Halle originally founded a charity school with the intention to teach young children a trade to enable them to earn a living. After having received support from the Prussian king, he turned the school into an orphanage, able not only to provide basic education, but also to be economically viable, thanks to several businesses run in-house and, in future, to carry out missionary activities. One of these businesses, for example, was a printing house that was run from the orphanage. With the Enlightenment, private charity took a sharper shape, and the concept of philanthropy, intended as the private promotion of welfare, was born. Intellectuals and members of the bourgeoisie would select a specific social challenge, for example, prison reform or feeding the poor, and champion for its improvement both at home and, increasingly, in a transnational setting. In early modern history, thus, economic welfare and poor relief were not universally available, but remained mostly linked to ecclesiastical and charitable activities. Poor relief and access to education, in particular, remains available only to parts of the population, and especially in urban areas. So, can we reasonably say that we have examples of social engineering in the early modern history? Well, the fragmentation of the activities and initiatives put into place by the authorities, as well as the fact that they were short-term in nature and often paired with private initiatives, do not allow us to talk about social engineering per se during this period. It's of note, however, that society did change throughout the 300 years that compose early modern history, most likely as a result of several factors that include the effect of multiple short-term welfare policies, ante litteram, and activities. We can therefore comfortably say that the early modern history prepares the foundation for what will be future attempts at social engineering in modern and contemporary history. Before jumping into these two periods, however, I would like to underline the multifaceted nature of society, policies, and societal changes across Europe throughout early modern and contemporary history. Despite it is possible, in fact, to identify trends across Europe in modern and contemporary history, I would really like to invite you to bear in mind from now to the end of this presentation that the developments that I will be talking about took place unevenly across time and space. Expectations on what society should look like, as well as local history and political context, differed across Europe, and this is reflected in the European history. What worked for an area would not necessarily work in another part of Europe, and each national or local authority would learn from the experience and experiments of other authorities, adapting them for their own particular context. That being said, I would like now to look at social engineering and welfare in modern history. Throughout the 19th century, in Europe, we assisted to a series of sharp and quick changes in society. Industrialization developed more rapidly than before. Migration both within Europe and overseas picked up pace. Population growth saw new unprecedented rates. This had, of course, an impact on the composition of families, which lowered in size and found themselves more spread across Europe, as well as on the way the workers organized in local and transnational groups. At the same time, individuals started seeing themselves more and more as citizens worthy of social rights and started demanding an active role of the state as the protector of such rights. As a consequence, the state began some forms of social engineering. To look more in detail into social engineering and welfare in modern history, we will focus on urbanization, labor, family, and social policies. In the 19th century, urbanization skyrocketed. It suffices to say that at the beginning of the century, 1 in 10 people, so a little bit less than 10 million people in absolute numbers, in Europe lived in a city. While at the end of the century, this number increased to 1 in 3 people, or around 110 million people, counting also for the absolute growth of population. This process was imbalanced across Europe, and England and the Netherlands saw the fastest growth. The sheer speed of the growth posed a clear challenge to the authority. How do you handle the increasing of people in the city? How do you ensure that they can move around, that they can live in sanitary conditions, that they have access to a minimum amount of services? The systematic management of cities required intent and urban planning. And so urban planners ante litteram, because the institutionalization of professional urban planning, we will see, came only in the late 19th century, started to reshape the cities. An example of this is Paris, which under the guide of Baron Haussmann saw its medieval cores and street structures, as well as great portions of its old world, turned down, and new buildings rebuilt, leaving space to large boulevards, which would grant not only smoother inner circulation, but also an easier connection with the outbound and inbound commercial arteries. We can see in the image in the presentation, for example, Rue de Rivoli, which was the first of these big boulevards that was built by Baron Haussmann. Urbanization and industrialization inevitably carried with them social inequalities and the so-called social question of how to improve the health, the living and working conditions of the members of the working class. This question became very high on the agenda of industrialized European countries. In several cases, the answer was found in paternalism. Large industrial families will provide access to care, to work security, and to housing to the families of their workers. Other responses came from socialism, but in its original Marxist imprint, calling for revolution, but also in its utopian revision, promoting the creation of ideal communities of solidarity. In the last 20 years of the 19th century, several voices started to call also for state intervention, or alternatively for collective and organized action on behalf of the working classes. The 19th century saw also important changes in families and in their composition. With the advent of factory work, more and more families found themselves depending on the wage of the male breadwinner. This was not always possible, and nuclear families found themselves seeking the charity of the state and poor relief, which at the same time grew increasingly linked to paid employment. In addition, women and children found themselves at the center of a dedicated right movement, that for the rights of mothers and wives, and that of the protection of children's rights, which was also connected, we will see in 1 second, to the increasing infant mortality rate that was worrying the population at the time. All the factors mentioned above, industrialization, urbanization, the changing nature of labor and family, to mention some, brought with them a challenge for all social actors: how to interact, either preventing or channeling, the social unrest that came inevitably with this change. Social actors had different responses to this. Workers started unionizing, and members of the middle class started relying on savings and on insurance schemes. Both solutions had a major pitfall, though. They were local, and they did not protect people who were moving. So you would have your safety net in the country where you were staying, in the city where you were based, where you were born, where you were started working. But if you moved from there to a bigger city or to another city, you would lose your insurance scheme and your savings sometimes, and your safety net. Yeah. At the same time, nation states that started forming or that started consolidating their power across Europe started to dread this social unrest, which was very, very dangerous, especially for newly born states, and to become increasingly involved in the social questions as a means to present this social unrest from bubbling up. For example, they started to provide compensation for accidents on the workplace or hygiene standards, and they started looking into potential solutions to invalidity, to old age. For example, they started working on retirement schemes, which will arise at the end of the centuries, or of course, for solutions for unemployment, such as unemployment checks or employment for unemployed people. An example of this state involvement, which will then be replicated across Europe, is Germany. Germany was a fairly newly born state. It was born during the 19th century. And in the 1880s, under Otto von Bismarck, they introduced a series of insurance schemes for disability, for accident, health insurance schemes that were tax-based. And this was a tax-based welfare program that will continue to evolve in contemporary history, and that would be picked up by other countries. This is exemplified by the image that you can see in the presentation, which is the tree that represents German insurance systems. So every branch of the tree represents a different type of insurance. We have invalidity insurance, we have health insurance, we have accident insurance, and they together create the trunk that is the welfare state. In the 20th century, we witnessed to several waves of changes in population and its composition, mostly due to external pressures, such as, of course, the Two World War, the economic crisis of the interwar period, so the Great Depression, the decolonization movement, the fall of the Iron Curtain, just to mention a few. This is one of the elements that determined further changes in urbanization and family, as well as the rise of new theories and approaches to labor and to the welfare state. State-driven intervention decreased, partly due to two main factors: the rise of new political ideologies and the growing know-how and capacity of European states to intervene. So state intervention increased because states were more and more able to intervene in an effective way. Also, in the case of contemporary history, I would like to look at urbanization, family, labor, and then finally at the social policies of the period. Urbanization in the 20th century can be divided in two periods. Before the 1970s, urbanization was still determined and characterized by industrialization, as it had been in the previous century. In this period, increases in urban population brought with them rising social tensions that required to be solved by professionals. It is for this reason that in this period, urban planning becomes an academic discipline, with a first university course on this topic offered at the University of Liverpool as early as in 1909. Urban planning started before developing patterns that could be studied. And in this period, this pattern includes the Garden City, which proposed the resettlement of inhabitants in the green belts outside of the city, of the industrial city centers. And it's considered by many the precursor of suburbanization, so the creation of these areas where people would sleep to then move to the center to work, as well as the creation of what we would call now dormitory cities. A second model is the model of City Beautiful, which covers cities where the city is redesigned to reflect political grandeur, as it's the case of Nazi Berlin or of Stalinist Moscow. City Beautiful is an interesting example because what happened was that in the 19th century, we have the examples of Paris or of Vienna, which is exemplified in the image in the presentation, where the city is redesigned to reflect the grandiosity of the city. These examples were then picked up by American cities such as Chicago, and they came back from the United States to Europe, and they were then picked up by Nazi Berlin or by Stalinist Moscow. The last pattern that we can identify is zoning. Zoning is not a unitary pattern, but we have a different series of movements, of approaches to zoning. And zoning tried to promote the equilibrium between urban areas that centered around different activities. So you would have a zone dedicated to services, a zone dedicated to industry, a zone dedicated to health, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, all these three paradigms, so city beautiful, garden city, and zoning, failed to different extents. This, together with the economic crisis and the movements for self-determination and democratization that we see blooming up across Europe and beyond in the 20th century, lead to changes in the urbanization model. After the 1970s, in fact, we witnessed the rise of what we can call the post-industrial cities, where urban spaces in Europe deindustrialized, moving demanufacture in their surrounding areas, while service economy, connectivity, migration, and tourism within the city increased. These, of course, determined also shifting in the urban planning paradigm, which had to grow more flexible in order to be more receptive to the local needs, but at the same time became quite vulnerable to the economic interests, because with flexibility came this type of vulnerability. The second period, so after the 1970s, of urbanization is also impacted by the reunification of Europe after the end of the Cold War, which brings with it regional disparities between Western and Central Eastern Europe, because Central and Eastern Europe, and we will see it throughout the rest of this presentation, but also you will see it in other presentations that were made within this project. Central and Eastern Europe Central and Eastern European countries, found themselves coming back to Western Europe and getting closer to Western Europe and having to, or wanting to change their, in this case, their urban planning model, but also their economic model to fit within the bigger European picture very, very quickly. And this had a very big impact on urbanization, in this case, and urban planning. Moving on, also in the case of family and reproduction, in the 20th century, we pick up exactly where we left off at the end of the 1800s, with a widespread anxiety related to decreasing fertility rates and to the health of babies and children. This anxiety gave birth, pardon my pun, to policies that aimed at improving the birth rate, also as a means to ensure that countries would have a high amount of youth in the future ready to defend the nation in case of war. At the same time, in the early 1900s, we can see increasing infant mortality rates, and several states try to counter this in two main ways. The first was issuing policies that were encouraging and protecting the family, which would include milk dispensaries and the introduction of family allowances and prizes for mothers bearing many children, such as the Order of the Maternal Glory that you can see illustrated on the slide. But also, and this is the second approach that many states had to countering infant mortality rate, to reducing infant mortality rate, by means of eugenics as a tool to engineer society. This was carrying out mostly by giving incentive to mothers and families bearing healthy and strong babies predominantly. Things changed after the Second World War. For one, some of the policies suffered a big backlash due to their focus on eugenics, which was now associated with the experience of Nazi Germany. State-run policies continued to play a major role, but their focus moved toward public-funded education and childcare, especially toward how to respond to the changing natures of families, where also the mother was now working. As well as many policies went towards what would then become parental leave, and at the beginning was maternal leave. This is especially true in the communist bloc, where the mother was expected to return to work shortly after having given birth to her child and needed high-quality support during this period. Finally, declining birth rates continued to shape public debates also in the post-war period. They were no longer determined by worries about nationalism and militarism, however. So no longer in the beginning of the century where declining birth rates would become a problem when and if there would be a need to create an army. But they were determined by the fact that in many countries, such as, for example, Western Germany or Italy, The welfare state and the social security system was based on tax revenues. This means that they relied on young workers to contribute part of their salaries to keep these social security systems going. When it comes to labor, throughout the 20th century, we can assist to an improvement of the working conditions across the board, also related to the involvement of the state in welfare and social policy. At the same time, wars, economic crisis, and globalization had a big impact on how people view their relationship with work in the century, and made it so that the relationship between the state and social policies can be viewed as a wave consisting of peaks and dips, especially in the interwar period. In the early years of the century, liberalism started being criticized in favor of bigger state interventions on the labor market, especially in response to the pressure of trade unions. By 1915, national pension, insurance systems, and relief for the earners of poor wage had been institutionalized in several countries across Europe, including France, Germany, the UK, Denmark, Belgium, Austria, and Luxembourg, just to name a few, with state intervention gaining more and more traction and being even more widespread during the First World War. However, when the peace was restored, this movement lost its momentum, and the social policies that were in place were weakened during the crisis of 1929. In many countries, for example, in Germany, the effect of the crisis demanded a reduction in the social spending on the part of the state, which then determined the cutting and the cancellation of several insurance, unemployment, and assistance schemes. This was exacerbated by the Second World War and by the need to finance the war efforts. At the end of the war, we assist to renewed efforts of states and governments to take action and intervene in the economic life. In Western Europe, economic policies inspired by the theories of John Maynard Keynes, aiming at pacing economic growth and wealth distribution, and by Jean Monnet, focused on state intervention and planning, were implemented across the board. In parallel, governments intervened more and more also in the social sphere, expanding the field of the welfare state as a principle of national solidarity, the nation and the community as guarantor of the well-being for everyone. Looking at urbanization, family, and labor in contemporary history, we can clearly see that throughout the century, the landscape was changing, both in terms of the economical, social, and political landscape. This determined the creation and the institutionalization of a series of approaches to social policy and of welfare systems, as well as the institutionalization of a series of professional figures that would help the state to implement this system, for example, urban planners that we spoke about a little bit earlier in this presentation. In the West, these systems can be classified around three main models, following sociology Gustav Esping-Andersen. We have liberal welfare states, where the state is involved to the minimum, for example, in the United Kingdom or in the United States. We have some conservative models, where the state is involved specifically in family-based systems, for example, Austria and Germany and the Netherlands. And then we have social democratic models, where the state is highly involved in supporting social life, such as France or Belgium. It is important to note, however, the several states lay at the intersection of these models. So they are not quite conservative models, but also not quite fully social democratic models either, for example. And so the boundaries between these three models are not clearly detached from one another. East of the Iron Curtain, the countries of the Socialist Bloc and of the Soviet Union followed a model of welfare system based on Marxist ideals, focused on a high degree of state intervention in the social life of the citizen. From the end of the 1970s, however, we can assist throughout Europe, first in Western Europe, and then after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, also in Eastern Europe, to a distancing of the state from society, often corresponding to an erosion of the welfare state in favor of a public-private tension, where the private is trusted with the creation and maintenance of the support system, either by means of private insurance or through employment-based schemes. And this is the situation where we find ourselves today a little bit. The situation is evolving and is different from country to country. That's it for me. I would like to thank you for viewing this presentation and to warmly recommend you to have a look at chapter 4.2 of the handbook, The European Experience, a multi-perspective history of modern Europe in the 1500s to 2000 for a more in-depth analysis of social engineering and welfare. Today, we've only barely scratched the surface by looking into early modern history, what was the status of social engineering and welfare in the time, and whether we can call what happened in the period social engineering. And then we looked at modern history and at contemporary history through the lenses of urbanization, family, and labor, and then a little bit into welfare models. The chapter goes much more in depth into all these aspects and provides so many examples. So I would really recommend that you just, check it out. Thank you.